I had this kind of awakening moment where I was like, wow, if this happens today, this is going to be huge. And I was training all the hours I had, wanting to be the best, wanting to go to an Olympic Games. Yeah, I think I underestimated the sadness. We're all going there to hear the worst news any parent can hear, and everything kind of came crashing down, So I realised I needed to find a better way.
Gabby, welcome to Gold Mines. It's amazing to have you. Normally, you're asking me questions, and we are trackside witnessing some amazing golden moments. But today, I'm going to get to delve into your golden moments and some of your career highs. So if we can start with your golden moment and why you've chosen it.
My golden moment is the Women's Euros success at Wembley in 2022. And I guess my closing link, which seemed to really resonate with people. And that whole Euros was so special and so spectacular the way it finished. And it was on the day itself, driving to Wembley, that I had this kind of awakening moment where I was like, wow, if this happens today, this is going to be huge. This is the culmination of so many years of work, of toil from these women, from people who were supporting women's sport, people pushing women's football, from the ban that the FA put on to women's football for 40 years, to professionalism. And having worked on women's football since I joined the BBC in 2007, that was a long time of seeing that change. And I immediately thought, I need to kind of reflect this in a closing link. If they win today, how huge that is. And I got my iPad open and I kind of scribbled these words down. I closed the iPad, got into work, did all the stuff, as you know, that goes on in telly and preparing and getting on air. And of course, with sport, you never know how it's going to go. And England didn't do it easy, did they? They didn't make it easy for us as viewers and fans, and they ended up going to extra time. And at that point, I'm thinking, oh, well, I'll never use those words. Never mind, I'll think of another closer, which will be just as, impressive. Yeah. And then, of course, Chloe Kelly scores the goal. They get the winner in extra time. They win the Euros. And in the aftermath, it was just chaos, as you can imagine, the noise and the celebrations. But I was so determined. I wanted to say this kind of minutes closer. And the only person I told was the editor of the whole show. And I just said to him, this is what I'm going to say. And he said, yeah, that's great. And so I got to deliver it. And it was received really well. People seemed to really relate to it and love it. And I got so many messages from people from all over the place afterwards just saying, wow, that was a really powerful way to finish. And what happened was all about the football. But when you've worked on broadcasts like that for years and years and years, it's such a satisfying, delightful feeling to see it finally kind of come to fruition, to see all that hard work. And I felt like on that day, I kind of nailed it.
You absolutely nailed it. And I think, that was your big moment, but actually it took probably, quite a big journey to get to that point, to become the woman that you were in that moment, to be that confident and to deliver that really important message to the nation. So if we go back a little step, I've asked you to bring in a few items with you. And if we think about your journey into sport, we'll go right back to the beginning. And I know you've brought in something to share with us. I think it's a clip here that we can get up and have a quick look at.
So when I was 15, I was a gymnast and I was training all the hours I had spare from school, and probably up to like 25, 30 hours a week training, and wanting to be the best, wanting to go to an Olympic Games. And at that age, I just started competing for Great Britain, and there was a big competition coming up at Wembley. It was called, I think, the Silent Night International, and it was the one that everybody domestically wanted to be in because it was the only big international in the UK that we brought gymnasts from all around the world. And I got selected with another gymnast to compete in that. And I don't think they'd sold their tickets allocation or enough tickets. And so they said, would you go on Blue Peter with this other gymnast, Alicia, and advertise the competition? And of course, Blue Peter was huge then. Yeah. This is like the back end of the 80s when it was on a few nights a week, millions of viewers. I mean, massive audience that you'd absolutely scream out for and be delighted for on Saturday night telly now. We took it for granted back then, didn't we? And so it was a big show, and I went down to the BBC and I was in this kind of studio environment, this whole TV world with the lights and the camera and everything for the very first time, seeing a live studio. doing the routine that they'd asked us to do, and, you know, the director saying, you know, roll, and the lights going on and the presenters there and the music, that famous iconic music playing. And then afterwards I had such a buzz. I thought, I'd really love to work in that environment. It seems really exciting. Everybody seems to be having a great time. And so I wrote to the editor of the programme, who was a guy called Lewis Bronze, and said, I'd like to be a television presenter and work in TV. And he wrote back this really lovely letter via the British Gymnastics Association saying, that's very nice. Why don't you go to university? That's basically what it said in a nutshell. So it wasn't quite the career path I was looking for. And so my mum, who's always seemed to know stuff that I'm surprised that she knows, said, why don't you just apply to lots of places for work experience? So I used to write to radio stations and I'd write to newspapers. And eventually I got a week's work experience on a national newspaper, and they actually put me on the sports desk, funnily enough. But it wasn't kind of, you know, at the time what I thought I would do. I just wanted to work in that environment. But I knew that wasn't going to be kind of something that I could just jump into after school, and gymnastics was not going to be a job. So I was thinking about how I got there, basically.
So when you were on Blue Peter though, and obviously you're doing gymnastics, which you loved, and then seeing, you know, the razzmatazz of TV and all the lights and everything that you described there, was gymnastics still a passion, or did it completely flip for you then? It was like, gymnastics is great, but actually this is something that is, you know, way more attractive to me.
No, I'd say gymnastics was still the burning passion, because I was yet to achieve what I thought I could in the sport. But because I knew gymnastics was never going to be a job, this is pre-national lottery, so we weren't even funded. We had to rely on parents and part-time jobs. There was a sports aid grant that you could get. I'm not sure if sports aid was around when you...
Sports aid, yeah.
So I managed to get a sports aid grant, which helped with travel and a bit of equipment, but I was never going to be a full-time gymnast like a lot of our gymnasts are now, which is fantastic. So I thought, well, this I'll do as far as I can, but eventually I'm going to have to go and do further education, go to university.
But how did you find gymnastics though? I know obviously you're from a sporty family and your dad was a Premiership footballer. How, you know, were you just in this environment where sport was just, you know, part of your core and it's what everyone did, or was it something that you... just found accidentally?
No, it wasn't an accident. I think gymnastics was an accident, but sport wasn't, because it was kind of our love language. You know, everybody did sport in our family. My dad was a professional footballer, as you say, and then a manager. My mum was a professional sports mum, you know, so she was dropping 4 kids off at various sports. And I wanted to be a tennis player. That was my burning desire.
I love that. I read that in your book that I never knew that about you. It's really interesting.
So when I was 9 years old, that was my complete obsession. And I wanted to go to Nick Bollettieri's academy because I'd seen a documentary on it. My mum and dad, for some reason, didn't send me there. You know, they were
rude.
So unfair. And we moved back from Vancouver, where I'd found tennis, and it wasn't as abundant in England, you know, at that time. In Coventry, where we moved to, there was actually an indoor tennis centre. And my sister used to go to gymnastics there because they took one of the courts over for gym. And then I was playing tennis. And then very quickly, my dad got a job at Bradford City. So we all moved to Leeds. And Leeds had one indoor court, which was a private club. There was no way my parents were paying for me to be a member of this club. So my mum said, well, just play at Roundhay Park in Leeds. But they take the courts down at Roundhay Park pretty much a few weeks after Wimbledon, and then put them back up a few weeks before Wimbledon. So this was October. Nobody was playing tennis outdoors in Leeds, you know. So I thought, right, well, I'll just go to gym for a while with my sister until the courts open up again, or I find somewhere to play. So I kind of started gymnastics just because it was something to do until tennis came back, and tennis didn't sadly come back.
Just before we get into the rest of the episode, I'm thrilled to share that this episode of Gold Mines is sponsored by Audible. As an athlete, I spent countless hours training, travelling and preparing for competitions. And always before a big event, I like to take my mind off the stress I was feeling and get lost in an audiobook or podcast. It's a way to focus my mind and calm the nerves and step into a different world, even if it was just for a short while. One of my favourites right now is How to Change Your Life by my good friends Jake Humphrey and Damian Hughes. It's been a game changer for how I think about my time and focus. Whether it's an audiobook, podcast, or audio drama, Audible are the specialist in sparking imagination in life's ordinary moments. That's because there's more to imagine when you listen. Listen on Audible now. Subscription required. See audible.co.uk for terms. Now let's get back into the episode. And so obviously with your dad though and his position and you know, like say as a coach and moving around a lot, you obviously, you know, lived in lots of different places. Do you think that ability to, adapt and to move and all the, you talk a lot about the core values that sport gives you as well. Do you think they were all really key things in your, in your development as a gymnast, but then obviously what you went on to do in your later career?
Yeah, I think so, because one of the things that comes from moving around with a dad who's a footballer, I was going to say a sportsman, but actually football's quite unique like that, isn't it? Because, while you might change coaches as an athlete, you tend to stay where you want to stay. Yeah. Whereas a footballer has to suddenly uproot, go, and often the family come behind, which we were always a few months behind, my mum packing up a house and selling it and moving on and moving schools. And when we came back to England from Vancouver, I only thought about this the other day, I'd gone to 3 schools in a year. Wow. So if you think about at 9, 10 years old, having to make friends, pick up with friends, or you might have been to that school before, which we had, but then you have to leave again, and not having the right uniform, starting the first day looking not like the rest of the school, all those things I think make you quite resilient, because you have to just get on with it. And there were 3 of us, the older siblings, who were quite a gang. We were 3 years apart, 3, 2 and 1. So we had each other, but of course you're in different classes, doing different things. And I suppose sport was a way of joining in and being part of a team. And I had an ability, I was quite good at sport, and I enjoyed doing it. So whether it was the rounders team or the netball team, it was a way to get friends, to get quickly have, I suppose, an identity. So people knew you as that person that did, whatever sport you were doing. So sport fulfilled a social kind of need, and also I loved the physical feeling of whatever I was doing, and I was also quite competitive, so it was a natural comfort, if you like.
Yeah, because I suppose if you, like you say, at that age you're changing so much, aren't you, in your friendship circles, and that consistency and routine is such a big part of who you are, and then to have to adapt and move constantly and forever be the new girl at school is a really hard thing to deal with, and I'm sure that has shaped you again, the way you are today.
Yeah, I think so. I think we weren't shy kids, which helped. And I suppose you kind of look chicken and egg. Were we not shy because of the experiences, or was that just the way? I think my mum sold it to us quite well. She always made it an adventure rather than something that we should fear. Yeah. And it was always exciting, and she always seemed to kind of, I don't know, she just made it fun. And so we didn't ever feel like we were going somewhere that was going to be scary, or we weren't going to have her at the end of the day waiting for us, at the end of the school day. So, and of course my dad was also working and doing his job, so he was around, and footballers tend to be around a bit more, especially when they're playing in the afternoons, and so it was I think overall a positive experience, really. I mean, things like that can shape people in a way that is quite negative, because you can feel quite isolated, or it can, I suppose, exacerbate some of your natural tendencies. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to mingle and mix, it's easy, isn't it, to feel quite isolated.
But again, I was reading a book the other day by a social psychologist who was talking about raising kids, and we often try and protect our kids so much, don't we? And we don't want them to be too, open to discovering new things. So we're like, there's dangers out there, and there could be someone that could hurt you, and we try and guard them to a certain extent and keep that routine around them. But actually, he was saying that the ability to let your kids discover and not be on high alert all the time, and to adapt and put them in lots of different environments, is an amazing skill for them to have to harness when they're older. Yeah. And I think that's something that perhaps has changed a lot over the years.
Yeah, and I think sport also does that, doesn't it? Because just joining a sports club and being part of a team that will lose, and doing a sport where you're going to lose, is really important. You can't have children that just win all the time. And I think it's really important. Certainly it's something that I've adopted in my parenting, that I would definitely have given my kids, hopefully, the freedom to try things and not protect them too much from those disappointments, or obviously physical danger. You don't want to put your kids in unnecessary physical danger, but there are things that are going to happen. If you climb a tree, you might fall out.
Exactly. And they have to actually, I mean, you don't want them to be scarred and have scars, but you actually do want them to experience bumps and cuts and bruises, because they adapt and they get stronger and they learn.
Yeah, and certainly moving around countries and schools definitely made us adapt and learn.
And more resilient, yeah. So, I mean, thinking about your memories as a child, I think it's always nice to kind of cast your memories back to being a little child at home. And What are your fondest moments with your family and moments that stick out to you?
Yeah, I think and it goes to sport again, I think we always seem to have dinner together. If my dad was home, my mum was very good at making sure that we all sat down together. That's something that I really believe in. I think that's so important because so many conversations happen at the dinner table and so much is learned, I think, from each other. And also, I think in terms of food, it's really important. I'm really big on healthy eating and having a good diet that has, lots of variety in it. And I think when you sit down with your kids to eat, I think that's something that they want to be. Either they want to show you that they like this food, like, you love it when an adult praises you as a child. I always remember my mum saying, "Gosh, I can't believe how much you love aubergine," and of course that made me want to eat more aubergine. And so those experiences always stick out in my memory. A lot of our kind of happiest times were sitting around a table together, but then after dinner going outside and playing sports. So my mum would clear up and my dad, she'd say, "Get them outside," and my dad would set up, put some jumpers down. Right, this is where the tennis court would be. We didn't have a tennis court, but he'd go, "This is where the net is," and it's about this high, and we'd play some kind of racket game, or we'd have races, or we'd play football, or just do something that was quite competitive. But those memories, I think, are the strongest, and us being together as a little team with my mum when my dad was ahead of us on those journeys. I think it was fun times. Lots of us packed into the back of an estate car, travelling up and down the country, going to watch him play, or going to see him in his flat when he moved down to South Wales because he was managing Swansea. He didn't leave the family home at that point. My mum decided roots are being put down now in Leeds. You can move now. So all those times are us together, I think, doing those fun things.
And were you all super competitive then? All of the siblings?
All the time, yeah. We had terribly, whatever it was, we could find a competition in it. So we'd on these long car journeys, we'd make up games. And one of the cruelest was how long you could keep a wet wipe in your mouth.
Gosh.
And my sister and I would surreptitiously take it out, and my poor little brother would still have his in, and be going green, about to be sick. Or how long you could hold a crisp in your mouth, and then we'd keep going, "Oh, we've eaten our crisp, we need another one." And my poor little brother would be there going, "I've still got the same crisp." So just anything could become a competition, basically. And then because there was three of us at that point, it was quite hard because there'd be 2 and 1 always. And because I'm the eldest, it seemed that I was always the one against the 2, So I'm sure we must have turned my mum grey prematurely because, we were just running around like lunatics the whole time and
I feel
loads
like
of energy.
Eldest is always the most competitive as well in a strange kind of way.
Well, I think the one that takes defeat the worst probably as well.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
you're expected to win because you're the eldest. So when it doesn't happen, you feel the most, and the most kind of affronted almost. I'm like, oh God, I can't believe that happened in front of everybody. I didn't win.
And I suppose, like, you think back and you've had some incredible times with your family and the environment that you've been in from a young girl. But then obviously you had the tragic loss of your brother Daniel. And I've read your book and I've heard you talk about it in the past that I can't actually comprehend that in any way, and what an awful time it must have been for you and your family. But how did that shape you, like your perspective on the world and you as a person, and like physically, how did it affect you?
I think you at 19 you're not fully formed anyway, your opinions and your experiences. I mean, are we ever fully formed? But at that point, I suppose you're changing anyway. So I never really know kind of how much it was what happened at that age and how much was going to be me anyway. But I definitely feel it probably accelerated a lot of my tendencies, if you like. So, I am somebody who's very active, very proactive, and I try and kind of find a way through something and try and be positive, and I'm busy and I like to do lots of things. So I think his death made me feel very much like it was right. I described it as carpe diem on acid to somebody the other day, which they thought was hilarious. And I was like, but it was kind of like, right, I'm going to seize the day and then some, because I'm going to live 2 lives. I'm going to make sure that his life isn't in vain, the 15 years that he had on this planet. And so there was that part of me that was right. Okay, let's go. And then, of course, the other part, you have to grieve, and that grief has to find a way through. So you can't just keep running and hope that you can outrun grief. It will catch up with you at some point. So I think probably a year down the line from when he died, I was at university and everything kind of came crashing down. Physically, I wasn't sleeping well, and I just wasn't processing things very well. And I went to see a doctor who said to me that he'd prescribed me with sleeping tablets, which I didn't think was a very good answer. And my dad said, don't go down that road, because I think he'd used sleeping tablets a lot in his career and he didn't want me to do that, and I didn't want to do that. So I realised I needed to find a better way. And I've always since then really been a fan of using talking therapies or seeking out help, whether it's from a counsellor or, you might just need it in pockets of your life. You don't know when you're going to need it, but it's not something that I've ever felt ashamed about, because I couldn't deal with all that on my own. And in a family where everybody's grieving and everybody's got their different ways of grieving, you don't just turn to your mum in the same way that you would have done about other problems and other issues.
And were you able to talk about it straight away, though, or was it something that took a long time?
Yeah, I always wanted to acknowledge his existence. I never wanted to say, so when I went to university, I didn't want to say to people, which was about 4 months afterwards, oh, I've only got 2 siblings, because I said I've got 2 brothers and a sister, but my brother died in May, and that, of course, was quite shocking to people, and some people don't know how to deal with it and they don't want to say anything at all. But I always wanted to, if I'd said that, I wanted to be able to then answer the next question if they asked me how he died or something about him, because I was very proud of him and I wanted his memory to live on. So when my parents got involved in various charitable causes afterwards, I wanted to be part of that as well. And I think it's quite cathartic and helpful to a lot of people. Find that you keep the memory alive of somebody. And it helps to just ease you into the life without them in a way, because the physical presence of the person has gone, so you still have all those memories and you still have all that grief. And I think it's a natural process for a lot of people that you want to just keep talking about them.
Yeah, and keep their memory alive. But I suppose, it's so hard to lose anyone, a family member, anyone close to you anyway, when there's been an illness and there's a lead up. But for Daniel, it was just so sudden.
Shocking.
And like how, I just try and think about how, I would feel like I'd be on such, like my anxiety would be through the roof, because I'd be so worried that could happen.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, it brings it to life in the most awful way, that something like that can just happen.
They say quite flippantly sometimes, life can change in a minute.
Yeah.
And life really did change in a minute for us. He was playing football in the garden with my dad and collapsed, and that was him gone. And he had a congenital heart disease, which was totally hidden. There was no visible signs or physical signs in terms of shortness of breath or anything that was, obvious that he was something wrong with his heart. So we didn't have a clue. I was in London at the time. I was on my gap year. My mum was in the house and my dad called her, and they thought he had maybe heat stroke, because it had been a really warm bank holiday in May. And so when they were heading down to the hospital, my mum was following in the car thinking that he was going to be fine, and he was going to have some hydration, maybe need some kind of drip, and he'd be back to, being Daniel. And so she was calling her mum, her sister, saying, oh, we're just going to the hospital, Daniel's collapsed, and you might need you to help me with Jordan, not thinking that they were all going there to hear the worst news any parent can hear. And it was about an hour after she arrived at the hospital that it was confirmed, and that was when she called me. And I remember picking the phone up, because it was a lovely evening. We were about to have a barbecue where I was living, and I picked the phone up. The window was open. You could hear people outside in their gardens. It was just a normal evening.
Yeah.
And when she said the words, "Daniel's died," I honestly thought for a second, Jess, oh no, he's been in a car and somebody's, because he wasn't driving, but at 15 you think, has he got into a car with somebody he shouldn't? I just could not imagine how this fit, healthy specimen of a young man who I'd been running with on Wimbledon Common 2 months before, who was signed to play for Leeds United, who was apparently like one of the most talented players of his generation. How could that happen? How could somebody with so much life have no life left at all? It just wasn't computing. And so it was a surreal kind of conversation, because what do you then say to your mum? What do you say to, how can, I wanted to get in the car and drive straight home, but then my then boyfriend said, just like, stay here. My mum said, no, stay where you are and come in the morning. I don't want you driving tonight. And, and so it wasn't until the next day that I walked into the family house, and that was really the moment I realised that things had changed forever.
Gosh, honestly, I've obviously known you for such a long time, but I've never heard you speak about, that whole time like that. And it just, it kind of puts everything into perspective, doesn't it? And I'm sure it's put your life and your family's life into future as well. And, the kids that you have now.
Yeah. And I think when I wrote my book, I I couldn't start anywhere else because there's kind of before and there's after. Because like you asked me the question, how did it change you? And undoubtedly it does change you, doesn't it? And you don't know fully how you would have been, but you can't imagine, often I do that thing where I do a sliding doors where I imagine life with Daniel now being 48.
Yeah.
Would he have been a football manager after his career? Would he have a wife and children? Would he be living near me? How would my kids and his kids, all those things that you kind of, and then you're driving along or something and you just go, okay, reality.
Does that give you comfort though, in a way, to think about?
Yeah, I think it's just, it's like there's a parallel world where all that didn't happen. And, and of course, because of the fallout of his death, lots of other stuff happened. My parents eventually got divorced and my dad had found, life very, very tough and used alcohol as a way to medicate himself and found work hard in the end and couldn't, hadn't worked for the best part of a quarter of a century now. And so his life became very, very insular and he changed totally. And my mum had a very different way of dealing with things. And my sister was living abroad and went back to live abroad and hasn't been back in the UK since, really. So, and then my brother had to grow up with all that. He was 6 at the time, so he had to grow up.
So he stayed in the family, obviously, for a longer period of time.
But with a very different childhood. That we started off chatting about how great that childhood was and how adventurous. And he had a very different experience because most of it was clouded, really, until he was in his teens with the immediate aftermath of the death of his big brother.
You talk about, the journey that you've been on as a, young athlete, your family dynamics. You obviously went on to the Commonwealth Games as well. Let's not forget that. You had these aspirations to become an Olympian. And I think you spoke about how the Olympics was just such a huge thing to you.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at a step back, the Commonwealth Games is the next best thing to an Olympics.
Yeah, it's a multi-sport event.
Multi-sport. You get to experience, different cultures, different sports, the village environment. And you went off to the Commonwealth Games as a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
What was your mindset like
in
at that
Auckland.
time? In Auckland, yeah.
I mean, it couldn't have been further away. Literally, there is not a venue further from Leeds that the Commonwealth Games could be in. And it was on my radar for probably, like an athlete, you look and it's a year in advance and you eventually get to qualify. It was bittersweet, the qualification, because we were hoping my sister would qualify as well. And they decided to only take one gymnast. And so that was quite hard.
How did that go?
It was tough
Yeah.
because my dad was managing Wales and I was competing for Wales. So he rang the sports editor of the Welsh newspaper that was going to announce the next day the team. I mean, this is kind of how antiquated it is now. Of course, they'd be on social media.
Check on Instagram.
Yeah. And he said, and my dad said, could you tell me who's in the rhythmic gymnastics team for Wales? And he said, it's Gabrielle Yoreth. And my dad was like, and he went, oh no, they're just taking one gymnast. And so my dad had to relay that news. And so it was really sad because obviously they were delighted for me, but I now understand as a parent, in some ways, when your kids have a crushing disappointment, that's more powerful than when they have a great achievement almost. Because
it's that saying, isn't it? You're, as a parent, you're as happy as your
least happy child.
Yeah, and it's so true.
Yeah, so, and I got that, but not fully at the time. I think I was a little bit, hey guys.
Yeah, I'm going to the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah. But now as a parent, I totally understand that kind of dilemma that must have felt between my parents kind of trying to divert their attention from me to console my sister. But once that had kind of gone and I was focusing on A-levels and going there, I was so excited. It was such a brilliant experience. It was everything I hoped for, Jess, and more. And gymnastics rhythmic happens usually on the last day or two of any event, Olympics or Commonwealth. So I was in the village. I think Wales must have got bucket shop price tickets or something. We were in there about 3 weeks before it started. I was like, there was nobody in the food hall when I arrived. I was literally going, is anybody else coming? And then eventually all the teams start arriving and, we were just having a ball, training really hard in the day, meeting people in the dining hall at night. And the first person I sat next to in the dining hall was Colin Jackson, can you believe?
Really?
Yeah. And I really...
Talk about full circle.
I had a massive crush on him as well.
Did you?
Yeah. And I sat down and I was, oh my God, it's Colin Jackson.
Did he have his gold jewellery? He talked about how he always used to have like lots of gold
he was just
medallions.
flash and handsome, and I was so in awe, and I knew, oh my gosh, if I'm on the Wales team, I'm going to be the same team as Colin Jackson. And so years later I told him, and yeah, he loved that, you can imagine.
Oh, he must have he's dining out on that forever. But so the Commonwealth Games was an incredible experience, and did you manage to have some fun out there as well?
Yeah,
it wasn't just all
had a lot of
competing.
fun, and the last few nights when you let your hair down, I'd never really been a party girl because I was always focused on gymnastics, and so I only took a couple of glasses of champagne or wine or whatever it was before I was on my back completely, blottoed. And now it seems ridiculous. I was practically throwing up in a cab. Ate some chocolate cake. It's crazy
Wild
times.
night.
Crazy times. Yeah.
We all live such busy lives. It's becoming harder to get all the nutrients we need to thrive. Arta's Advanced Multi-Nutrient has over 40 vitamins, minerals and herbs. They use all the foundational ingredients like vitamin D3 for energy and immunity, but also a lot of specialised ingredients like wild blueberry for cognition. And as a busy mum and podcaster, it takes the guesswork out of daily nutrition. Their award-winning range, which targets everything from gut health and energy to metabolism and longevity, is formulated expertly and with great care by their passionate founder, Rhiannon Stevenson. As a former elite swimmer and deeply experienced nutritional therapist, she understands better than most how transformational high-quality nutrients and supplementation can be, not just for athletic performance, but how good you feel day to day. Right now, you can save 20% across their range with the code GOLDMINES. Head to arta.co today. And then obviously you came back from the Commonwealth Games, and unfortunately your gymnastic career didn't go any further, which is, what an incredible high to experience that though. But like with any sport, it's highs and lows, isn't it? And
I came back with a bad back injury, and I'd been masking it with very strong painkillers. I was on very strong painkillers, and of course I couldn't keep taking those beyond the Commonwealth Games. And when the painkillers dissipated and my actual pain came to the fore, I had very bad sciatica, and so I was told I needed a bit of time off. I could have treatment and give it a couple of months and then come back into training. And I think I was doing my A-levels. Like I said before, it wasn't going to be a professional sport, and I grew up a lot in those few months, I think, and I felt I really love this sport, but I am not going to get to that Olympic Games. I knew there were 2 or 3 gymnasts ahead of me who'd be very unlucky to not be selected. Something would have to go wrong with them. I couldn't reach their standards, and that was a really hard thing to deal with because it was my everything. It was my dream, and I knew I'm not going to get there. So just focus on your A-levels and jack it in, but that's so hard.
That's really hard to do, because a lot of kids, teenagers that age, you'd keep pushing, wouldn't you? But actually you were very pragmatic and realised that this wasn't the route for you. You'd already had that Blue Peter excitement. That moment.
Yeah.
And you started forging yourself, another career and moving in another direction, which is really brave to do at that age.
Yeah, I think I underestimated the sadness. It stayed with me for a couple of years where I'd go out with my friends, I'd have a drink and then I'd just start crying, I miss it so much. And I just thought nothing's ever going to give me the buzz, the excitement because of course by this point I wasn't in any kind of relationship. I didn't have children. I think if I'd had children or something, I would have been able to put things in perspective. But I was a young girl with no other life experiences really. So I just felt like life was all going to be a bit downhill after gymnastics.
Well, you do as a sports person though. As soon as you retire, whatever age you're at and whatever level you've got to, you have that feeling of, well, I've peaked. Like I've done my best years and I've had such a great experience, and now I've got to go on to another phase.
And sport itself, like I started doing, I'd go down to my local swimming pool and the World Swimming Championships was on, and because I met so many swimmers at the Commonwealth Games, I thought, I'll see if I could be a swimmer. And I'd look at the time on the clock and go, no, that's not going to work. And then I started doing some cross-country races at school. Could I be a runner? No, 56th out of 100. And, the Yorkshire Championships, my high jump wasn't good enough. There was now
Revisit
I look
tennis.
back.
What about tennis?
Well, too late for tennis. But you know what I probably could have done is get on a bike, I reckon, because I'm not bad on a bike. And I think at 17, I probably would have been all that training, while it wasn't directly related to the sport. That mindset that I had about competition would probably have been quite a good start in that arena, and I think Talent ID really only came in about 10 years later, didn't it?
Yeah, there was no Talent ID, which made it a little bit harder. Skipping forward a little bit further though, you've brought in another item, which is a lovely picture. If you want to share that with us now and describe what you're holding for us.
So this is me and this is James Jordan. And you might recognise this kind of setup as being Strictly Come Dancing.
This is.
Yeah, and this was 2007.
Yeah.
And I would have been like 34 years old there. My kids were about 2 or 3. And I just started at the BBC and they asked me to do Strictly. And this was, which I can't remember which, and that was my publicity photo. That wasn't actually one of my dance dresses. But the reason I've chosen Strictly is a bit kind of counterintuitive, actually, because I had an amazing experience on Strictly. I was only on it a few weeks, but I had an amazing experience, but also a kind of life-changing experience in many ways, which sounds a bit dramatic. And you hear people going on Strictly saying it's changed my life, but this wasn't in a good way.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that Strictly was bad for me per se. I absolutely adored it. I can't stress how much I love the training. You can imagine I've just described how much I love training, and to go on Strictly where you can train 7 hours a day, and
Yeah, and I feel like the crossover as well, gymnastics and dancing. That, it was quite aligned.
Yeah, I mean, I did throw in a few splits and walkovers, but I didn't really have any dance training, so I had to learn a lot. But I loved it. And when you get voted out of Strictly, it's so shocking because you go in every week starting to work on your following week's dance and you don't expect to go home, right? And so I'd finished about just a quarter down the table, got some good scores for that week, but I was in the bottom 2 for the dance-off, which was quite a shock for everybody that I was there. And then I got voted out against Penny Lancaster. Now, it wasn't so much that itself, it was the fact that obviously people didn't vote for me, right? And now it sounds a bit pathetic, and you kind of people go, well, but we realise when it's a reality show that's about whether people like you. And I was very much aware that people didn't like me. I was kind of like, they didn't like me enough to vote for me. And my husband was he was also on it, Kenny. And
I didn't realise Kenny was on at the
and
same
people
time.
really liked Kenny.
Yeah.
He was finishing at the bottom, but staying on every week. He carried on for another 10 weeks, whatever. He got to kind of the quarterfinals, and he was rubbish. But
you can say that.
Oh no, let it go. But it was a very sobering kind of experience, because in the days afterwards, not only was I dreadfully missing the dancing, but also realizing that, I kind of felt like, why did people not, what was it about me that people didn't relate to or like? And some of the things that were being written about me were that I was too competitive. And there was this, I think there's been a real change in the way women are allowed to be competitive openly since then. But at the time, even in 2007, I was seen as somebody who was too determined almost and wanted it too much and looked too disappointed when her scores were low. Now I realise it's a reality show. You kind of got to play the game, and maybe I didn't get that. And James did keep saying to me, it's a TV show.
But I suppose when you come from a sporting background, though, you've got this idea of it's a competition.
Yeah.
And in a competition, you work hard, you put the hours in, you give it everything, and you're rewarded with a good score.
You train hard and you'll be good. That was kind of how sport worked. So this is what I'll do. And so I was very surprisingly devastated, in the sense that it shook me kind of almost how upset I was about it. And I wasn't going to be drawn into the kind of the narrative of, I shouldn't have gone out and all that kind of stuff, because that's what happens, right? So Kenny said, he rang the producer on the Sunday night after the results show, and he said, can I swap and keep Gabby in?
Oh, did he?
and I'll go out. And I didn't know he'd done this. And she said, which is quite kind of in your face, no, Kenny, they liked you, so they voted for you. Which he's loved to throw at me. He's thrown it quite a few times since. And so I was slightly kind of baffled by all this. I remember writing I sometimes write and journal when I can't make sense of things. And I remember writing lots of stuff thinking, how can I change? How can I be a person that gets across the real me that other people, my friends seem to like, and my family seems to like, and people really like Kenny. And I'm his partner.
Yeah.
And so it was a very confusing time.
What made you want to do it though in the first place? Was it
Strictly?
Yeah. Was it because obviously you're on the start of your presenting
BBC
journey,
career.
BBC career, and I suppose you think there is a big crossover with sport and the competitive side, and although it is TV, it looks like a fantastic experience.
Yeah, and it was.
It
was an amazing experience. I think you've got to go into it, and I'm sure these days they do sit down with people and say, remember this, people vote, and obviously don't take it too personally. There'll be reasons why they connect with some people and they don't connect with other people. And I probably didn't at that time. The show was, not brand new, but was more in its infancy. I think it was the 4th or 5th series. And I I was expecting to go further, not to win it, but I was expecting to go further because I really wanted to learn. I was so interested in the dances and how to get better at the dances and the music. It was just so up my avenue. I remember on the Thursday before I went out on the Saturday night, I was in the shower and I had one of those moments, you get them in life sometimes, where you just have that kind of clarity of thought where you feel like, oh, I'm in a really good place. I'm loving this. And I'd come home and I'd be dancing with the kids and, bring them to training, and they loved it. And they don't remember it. They were only 3. But I just felt in such a happy place. And then the rug just comes and it's pulled from under you a few days later. And on the Monday night, I'd gone to do a show I was doing called Inside Sport at the BBC, and Kenny was still training, obviously. And I got home that night quite late. It was about 10:30, and he'd already gone to bed because I think the passo was killing him. And I sat down on the edge of the bed and I said, oh, guess what? And he went, what? I said, the BBC have asked me if I'll present Six Nations Rugby. And he went, oh, I just can't get to grips with the passo. And I was like, this is so weird. Yeah, our lives have just gone like, it's kind of, he's basically the ex-rugby player who's trying to do the passo, and suddenly I'm doing Six Nations Rugby. And so, yeah, it was a very strange time. And I think the reason why I've chosen it was because I think in life, obviously, you think things can be going one way and then something happens to you. And of course, we've talked about how Daniel's death changed the trajectory of my life maybe, or speeded up certain things. But actually, as an adult, I look back now and realise that was a really good reset and a really good experience to go through, because it makes you take stock. Who am I? How am I coming, across? Am I doing the right thing always? Am I expecting too much of other people? Sometimes am I putting upon them my standards of, working hard as a sports person? Because I think in sport you can be like that with other sports people, but in the world at large, you maybe have to reframe the way you think about things. So it was probably a really good thing for me to go through and understand, and maybe understand a lot about how women are perceived in society as well.
And how what were the tangible things you did after that? Did you make changes? Did you start evaluating your whole personality and the competitive side of yourself? Because it seems a really harsh thing to do. Women can be competitive, but when you're judged in that way, it rattles you.
I realised that I was not going to be able to eradicate that completely within me, that competitiveness. But I purposefully tried to keep it under control and find positive and less obvious ways of releasing that, So, and I've never been somebody in my career that said, all right, I'm out to get them or that. I just want to do the best I can do. And my competitiveness is always against me, if you like. It's not about other people. I think it's amazing when you can help people in whatever area of life that, you work in. It's a really satisfying thing when you can lend your time to somebody, whether it's somebody contacting me on social media wanting to know how to get into telly, or, charities that you work with. All those things I find enormously satisfying. And it's not about, putting other people down to get to where you want to go. It's about just what can you achieve? How far can you go in something?
I think that's an incredible thing, because I think, a lot of time you can find the opposite, can't you? Where it's a real struggle for women to get in a position or a role, and then, some women try and hold other women down. And it can be quite challenging. But every time I've seen you or worked with you, you are always offering advice and, helping other women find a path through. And it reminds me of the Commonwealth Games. There was a young runner there, and I think she was from India, and she really wanted to be a presenter. And she was like, Gabby, how can I be a presenter? I want to do your job. And, you had all the time in the world just to give her bits of advice. And that is a massive thing. And I think that makes a huge impact on so many women's life. And, it gives them opportunities, and it continues this legacy, which is fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And then I suppose it goes on to your moment that you described at the beginning. And that continues this, legacy piece of not only your career and what you've achieved and how you've gone on to present incredible shows and come full circle, really. But for you to be able to really put into words and deliver that, final speech in that moment after the Women's Euros. I mean, did you feel a bit of pressure getting your words right? I'd be so worried that I was going to just bumble something up and not deliver it.
Well, because you wear an earpiece when you work with me, I take great pride in hitting the count. I never want to go over 0, and I always want to hit the count. And so I'd back-timed it. But of course, with the adrenaline and everything that was going, and wanting to deliver those words clearly because they were so important to me and not be garbled. So there was one bit where I speed up too much. I've seen it back a couple of times because I've been at award ceremonies and things where they played it, or TV event and thing where they played it. And there's a bit where I go, I was trying to speak too quickly there because I was worried I was going to
Run
not
out
hit the
time.
count. Yeah, but I think they would have just kept us on air because with hindsight, England had just won the Euros. They were not going to just pull us off air, you know. So yeah, there was a bit of pressure in that respect. But I think talking about what we've just said, and although I picked that moment, the Strictly moment, because it was quite impactful in my life, what I realise now, just talking to you, is, isn't it interesting how I felt I was being penalised being competitive, and then we come up to the Lionesses and people were adoring of women being competitive because 23 million people combined watched that Euros final. 1.9 or 1.2 million had watched the 2009 Women's Euros final when England were in it. So when you think about the growth of women's sport and how impactful that was on a nation and how those women became quite rightly heroines to a generation, that is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
To see that and see how adored they still are.
But it was such a pivotal change there, wasn't it? You kind of, been in sport, obviously myself for all the years, you see little changes, but that just felt like a huge sway. And then for you to then deliver that line and those lines where we have to rally everyone has to do their bit now, like that just, it just hit the nail on the head perfectly.
Yeah, the sentiment really was, don't just walk away from this and think that this is, first of all, don't think this comes easy. And if you really do think this is great and you really feel that what we're feeling right now, which is the power of sport, then stick with it. Go and put your bum on a seat and watch women's sport. Support women in their endeavours in sport and don't just talk the talk. And one of the most satisfying things since the Euros is the growth of the WSL every season on season. The attendance figures are going up, and the Emirates, where Arsenal play now, the women this season had 40,000 for their first game, and they were playing Man City, and the men were playing on the same day, and that is huge. That's a massive achievement, and they are, I think, the leaders in terms of how they've put their women right at the forefront. Arsenal and so many other clubs are doing great jobs, and it's not going to be the case that we're not saying that women's sport or women's football is going to be the same as the Premier League, and it shouldn't be the same as the Premier League. It's a different thing, but it's an entertaining showcase of great sport, and it should be appreciated for that. So yeah, it's amazing to see in just a couple of years what has happened post Euros.
And I think it's not just been a knock-on effect within women's football, it's been on a range of different women's sports, hasn't it? We've seen it, netball and rugby, and we've just seen more female role models having a position where they are on the front of a marketing campaign, or they are, visually seen more than they ever would have been in the past. And that then creates more little girls that want to come and, emulate what they've achieved. And it has a huge effect. And we're starting to see that now, aren't we?
Absolutely. It's not just about the high-end competitive performance, high-performance sport. It's about health. It's about girls sticking with sport beyond 12, 13, because that drop-off age, which is so classic, that girls drop out of sport and boys don't, is all about your long-term health goals. If you can keep doing sport through your teen years into your 20s, you're more likely to have a better prospect of health later in life. So we want to keep women active. And if there aren't clubs and facilities available, then it's much harder for them to keep active. So the growth of recreational netball, I've got friends in their 40s and 50s who picked up netball again after the 2018 success of England in the Commonwealth Games. And so many of my friends now do team sports that they hadn't done for years, and it's so brilliant to see, because that's also impactful, as well as winning medals at a very top end. And then you've also got the idea that young girls watch female sports people, whether it's footballers or athletes or rugby players, and they realise that there are no boundaries to what they can do, because maybe they before thought that was a boy's thing. Actually, what else in life do they think is a boy's thing that they can also do? And also for little boys and young men to see women achieving, that it shifts their mindsets, because they don't think there's any boundaries to what women can do either. No, and that's so important.
And I think, and the skills as well, like obviously all the values that you learn through sport and the skills that you pick up, whether you, like you say, you just stay at a grassroots level, you go to national, international, you have all these skills that you can then transfer into business or whatever career you go into in life, that has a massive impact on, how successful you'll be.
Well, I was hearing the other day from a very high level businesswoman that a lot of female CEOs competed at a decent level in sport, whether it's at university or whether they took it through to regional or national level. And that doesn't surprise me, because I think the other thing about sport, the juggle at the time, you feel like, how am I going to get my schoolwork done? I've got to get this. And then you get older, you realise that life's a juggle. It's always a juggle. And actually all that training that you did and all that kind of moving around schedules and making sure you got stuff done stood you in such good stead, and it made you quite a resourceful person. You didn't waste time, like I've got an hour to do this essay, so I'm going to get it done. I've got to get this done. And so all those kind of skill sets are never going to be wasted in the rest of your life. You might miss a few nights out, but you'll catch up with them.
You'll make up for them
and
in
you'll
later
be a cheap
life.
date.
Yeah, exactly. And you can eat chocolate cake and do whatever you like. I suppose my question now is about, was it your plan that you would go into sports presenting? Did you see that was your path, or was it just purely presenting that you wanted to go in? And how did you find your way into presenting sport?
I definitely didn't think I'd be a sports presenter. As much as I loved sport and I watched all kinds of sport, I started out in local radio doing all kinds of different shows and eventually graduated onto the breakfast show. So I graduated on the Thursday, started my job on a Monday as the breakfast show presenter, which was like Capital, that kind of station, any commercial kind of station in a local town. I don't know what Sheffield's, is it Hallam?
Hallam,
yeah. So it was Metro FM in Newcastle, and it was classic breakfast show where you do the traffic and travel and you talk to local people. It was brilliant, great fun, getting up at 4:00 in the morning, absolutely loved it. Finished work by 9:00, and by 10 I'd spent an hour chatting to the sports team. And eventually the head of the station said, every day you come and you just chat to the sports reporters and the sports team at the end of the office about Newcastle or whatever. He said, we think on a Saturday you should go and do touchline interviews at St James's Park after the match. You'd speak to the players, the manager. And I was like, how do you do that? I have no idea. What do you mean? And what would I ask them? And he said, don't worry, we'll train you up. And it was a slight reverse sexism thing because they had an old guy who was about 75 and he couldn't get the place to stop anymore. And so they decided that it was time for him to retire, and they'd get this young girl who was 23 who had a penchant for boots and short skirts, and it was the 90s, and so I started doing this on a Saturday. Absolutely loved Newcastle United, had a fantastic time, but again I just thought it was a Saturday job. I didn't think it was my career or my job because I didn't see any women really presenting high level sport.
I was going to say, did you just not think it was even an option?
Didn't think it was a path that I would go down. So at the end of that season, which was a really amazing seminal season, Newcastle had thrown away a 12-point lead at Christmas, final day of the season. There was a chance they could win it if Man United cocked up, but they didn't. And so Sky were covering the game because it was such a big game. And this guy gave me a little business card. He said, will you call this number? They want to make a documentary about women in sport. And I'm not a woman in sport. What does he mean? And they didn't want to do that. They wanted me to come down for a screen test. And it was a proper... like when you see a scene in a movie where life changes, and from one day being on the radio, the next flying down to London to do a screen test, being offered a job, and then going back and having to say to my boss, bye, I'm off to London.
I'm off to the big snake.
It was like, I thought, this is my film. I'm in my own film here. And I was driving down the A1, leaving Newcastle behind, crying my eyes out because I was going to miss Newcastle United. I was going to miss all the friends I had, but feeling like I had this big adventure ahead of me. But in a way, still feeling like, well, it's just a way to get to London, because surely I can't really be a sports presenter and do the football and all that kind of stuff.
Who were the other women at the time in those roles?
There weren't really any women. Helen Mollison was at the BBC doing bits and pieces on Grandstand, and I think Sue Barker probably started around then, but of course because she'd been a tennis player and she was on Wimbledon, for me you had to be a really high performing sportswoman to then go on and do your sport. Well, nobody wanted to employ a gymnast to do gymnastics presentation. There wasn't enough, you wouldn't have a job, so I didn't again see it really as something that I could do. But when I got to Sky, I started to believe it might be a possibility, and I really wanted to do football because that felt like the most important thing at Sky, but they just weren't letting me anywhere near the football. They gave me ice hockey, but they did give me hours and hours of experience. I was doing 2 shows a night, sports news, and it was like cutting your teeth without everybody watching because they weren't massively watched shows. You didn't have social media to respond to. It didn't exist. So I was able to do this without the gaze of people criticising me and telling me that I should get back in the kitchen, which is what eventually would happen. But by then, I'd already got a thick skin. I wasn't that bothered if somebody said that, But at that point... Is
it something that you... going on to the social media side, is it something that because it is part of what we do, if you're in the limelight and you're at the forefront of people's minds at the weekends covering various sports, you're going to get comments, you're going to get people, giving you input. It's
giving
life,
you their
isn't
feedback.
It? Feedback all the time. How do you handle that? Are you someone that, obviously after you're Strictly experienced, do you want to take on that information and learn from it and make changes, or are you I'm purely going to shut this down. It means nothing to me.
Yeah, I think it's important to be open and be coachable, and it's important to take advice and critique. But I think you've got to decide who those people are. And it might only be a handful of people that you really trust the input, the advice, or the reflections from. You can't look at social media and see hundreds of people telling you one thing or the other. I often get on a social media feed, especially on X, formerly Twitter, you'll get one of the worst questions or one of the worst interviews. The next one, that was amazing, right? So you get these two contrasting opinions right bang next to each other about something you've just done. And therein lies the problem, doesn't it? Especially if it's to do with a football match, because one of those will probably be the person of the team that's lost and the other one, the team that's won. And if their team's lost, they think everything you've just done is terrible, and they're allowed to because they're angry, they're upset, and that's fine. But I can't spend all my days going through things and going, well, yes, they had a point or they didn't have a point.
No, and it's where your focus goes as well, isn't it? Because you will always, as humans, we'll always naturally go to the most negative response or message that's sent to us, and you dwell on it. And, in actual fact, if you strip it back and the reality of what's been said and who said it, it shouldn't have an impact on you as a person and the job that you're doing.
If I happened to see something and was slightly worried by it, I might say to Kenny, did you think that question was right that I asked, or did you think that was, and if he says, actually, I thought maybe you're a bit harsh, or maybe that was, then I kind of take it, okay, maybe that was not great. But I think we really need to be careful about who we listen to and how we listen to them.
And has your mindset towards presenting changed over the years?
Yeah, I think so. I think the job itself has changed massively. The way we broadcast has changed. And obviously with the BBC, you have a lot of time often. We have a long time in athletics between sometimes races and events, and time to fill and time to chat. And so I think I've definitely changed my approach to the way I do things because of those requirements, if you like, at the BBC are very different to commercial television where you have ad breaks as well. And you can get into some really interesting conversations and have deeper chats, which I absolutely love. And then you might be doing something that's much more staccato and you've got to get your message over really quickly, So
I don't know how you do this because you can switch it on so quickly. So like you say, we have quite a lot of dead time, between live events that are going on in the track, and we can go into deep conversations and have a really good chat, and then next minute switched on and we're back on, and you're not on auto cue, you're just reading a script from your head and delivering on what's just happened and the next link that we need to go to. And that's an incredible skill. I watch you and I'm like, how is she doing this? But I imagine it's something that you've just learned over the experience that you had in radio and then, the different sports that you've presented.
I think there's a lot to be said for the hours and hours you put in. When you did your victory lap or your last lap of your 800 metres in London, that was the hours and hours and days and months of toil and training and disappointment and victories and defeats. Everything was that performance, And I think with any job, it's all the experiences, isn't it, that go into it that make you who you are. And when you're young, you're keen and you're hungry and you want to get on. You think you might have mastered one thing, but actually you look back and you realise that all those experiences helped you get to that stage and then moved you on to this stage and made you better at some things. And I think also being, it's back to that competitive word again, wanting to keep bettering yourself, wanting to keep moving the dial forwards and not rest on your laurels and feel like, I've nailed this now, because there'll be somebody coming along who really wants your job, somebody coming along who'd like to sit in your seat. And I feel like it's an absolute privilege to do the kind of stuff that I do. And I'm not quite ready to vacate that seat just yet. So I want to keep being evolving. As good as I can, and I love it. It's energizing. It's working with people like you. I come away from work feeling inspired and feeling just so happy. And if you can come away from work feeling happy, then that's success, isn't it?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what success means to you, but I think you've covered it brilliantly there. I think happiness is such a huge part, and I know you talk about your early journey into your career, and you've spoken about Strictly and also where you are now and that amazing moment at the Euros. But I think another huge part of your success and your happiness is down to your family, Kenny and Ruben and Lois. And, I've been lucky enough to spend a bit of time with them, and you've got such a gorgeous dynamic there. And I'm sure they've been a huge part in allowing you and enabling you to be the best that you can be.
Totally. I couldn't definitely don't think I could imagine a career that I've had and done things that I've done without a partner like Kenny. You know, he's so supportive and so unbelievably just, as you say, enable, you know, kind of go and do it, and believing in me and feeling totally confident that I can nail something when I feel perhaps it's not quite right. And, you know, he's just got an amazing attitude, but he's also from a sports background, so he understands hard work. He's not somebody that will get jealous of success either, because must be horrible if people, you know, are kind of competing in a relationship. He's very much at ease with himself and comfortable, and, you know, very good at what he does. And I think we have an understanding that sometimes I might have had to travel for work, sometimes he has to travel for work, but the thing that we've always been really united about is the kids and how we are with the kids, and that consistency, and trying to give them as many of the values that we really hold dear that we had growing up and from our families. You know, we both come from big families and lots of siblings, but also lots of cousins and, you know, all that kind of, he's from a farming environment, so there's lots of them around. So I think we both would probably say that is our feeling of greatest joy, you know, when we're all together doing something lovely as a family. So
and the kids are both pretty sporty as well, which is a nice added bonus.
Don't get me wrong, Jess, I tried musical instruments, I tried everything, you know. We did a lot of drama. There was a lot of Ruben actually did drama A level. He's really good at acting, and Lois did a lot of plays, and I was like, you know, do lots of things, but the natural kind of, as I say before, the love language comes back to sport, doesn't it?
Back to sport always, which is fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to just understand your journey and your path to the top, and enjoy some of the amazing highs that you've had. So thank you for sharing them with me today.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's been really delightful to be on the other side, if you like, with you. And I better watch out.
I think you're safe. Thank you.
Thank you.